Let's just tell you a little bit more about what we're going to be doing here right now. You may have noticed that I'm standing on the stage, and so are two members of our faculty. We've been talking about a lot of kind of abstract legalese terminology, and I know it can be difficult to think about what that looks like in human terms. So as a way to try to stretch our understanding of these concepts a little bit, what we're going to do for you today is dramatize some common scenarios where a faculty person or staff person might face a disclosure from a student. We're going to see how that situation would begin. We're going to pause and talk about it based on the material you guys have in front of you. And then we're going to see what it might look like concluded in a more or less ideal fashion. So that's the agenda for the rest of today. And so with that, what I'm going to do in just a moment is introduce our scenario. And I'm hoping we can all just have some candy, have a good conversation, okay? So any plan for the rest of the day, candy and Jack. So, that having been said, let me please introduce today Kathleen O'Reilly and Janet Hagan, who are here, our players. Round of applause, please. And let me introduce you to scenario one, the first point of conversation for us today. The major text of which is reproduced in the handout that you were given just a moment ago. Now, in this scenario, up to this point, what we know is that an afternoon class is about to begin when Ash, the student in the class, approaches the professor to talk about the behavior of another student named Mackenzie.
Hi, Professor.
Hi, how are you?
Good. I really didn't want to say anything, but I'm kind of tired of dealing with Mackenzie. I'm not sure what to do. So Mackenzie sits next to me and we talk, and you know, Mackenzie likes to joke a lot, and that's all good. But then all the jokes started to be about sex, and then it started to be about how hot I look, and you know, I don't like it.
We're going to pause. We're going to pause.
We're gonna pause.
We're going to pause the scenario here. Thank you. So, at this point, what I want to do is turn it over to you guys. Now, in front of you, you have on your handouts a few questions for focused discussion. So, among your groups, talking amongst yourselves, talking amongst your peers at your tables, if we can consider these three questions, we want to take about 5 minutes to talk about this amongst yourselves, and then we're going to come back together as a large group and hear from the tables all together and have a discussion about how we would respond given the circumstances. So, by all means, if you have any questions, we'll be here to ask, but in the meantime, let's turn it over to you guys. Let's see, talking amongst yourselves, what do you all think? So, we'll come back together very shortly. So, I just wanted to go through these questions with you. I'd like to hear what different parts of the room, different tables have to say about this. So, we have our core information that's been presented to us by the student, reported on our handout here, and we're posed with this first of the three questions. At this point in the conversation, would you argue it's a disclosure, a report, or none of the above? What do some of the tables think?
Disclosure.
Okay, we have a vote for disclosure over here. And are you feeling brave, Terry? Do you want to explain why your group came to that conclusion?
No, because she just explained the information. She just gave her information. She did not ask her to, or say she wanted to report it to anybody. She was just giving her the information of what was going on.
Okay. So you're saying that you're not quite detecting a request. You're not quite detecting an actual specific request for action at this time.
Right.
Okay, great. And other thoughts, either agreeing, disagreeing, different reasoning, what do we think?
It's somewhat none.
Somewhat not?
Yes. Reason being is we thought somewhat none because the professor here never said to her, or she never said that she told the other person that she was uncomfortable with this. So the other person has no idea that this is making the other student uncomfortable.
Okay, so at this time, the concern is that it's not evident that the desire for this to stop has been communicated to that person. And does this factor into what you guys think this would be in terms of a disclosure or a report?
We thought only a very loose disclosure because it's not an actual problem instance
Right. Okay.
as of yet.
based on the information we have so far.
Right, which
Okay.
isn't much, it isn't much information. Because right now, it could essentially stop.
Mhm.
But if it progressed where the person said, okay, I'm not comfortable with this, please don't say this to me, and then they kept going, then it would be a problem.
Right.
And
Okay.
then it would, they felt it would be more of a disclosure at that point.
Okay. And at that point, so you're looking at disclosure, and I think one thing we're seeming to talk about at the same time, which is a good thing, is how we're classifying the behavior being described. Sorry to make your job hard, Kim. To classify the behavior being described, and also what's being asked of us based on the information that's come forward. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about disclosure versus report, it does come down to what is being asked of us. But it all starts with, well, what's the actual offense? What are we worried might have happened here? So it sounds like maybe there's a little bit of ambiguity about whether or not we would consider this an example of sexual misconduct. Am I right there? Okay, so what do we think on that point? What do we think? Is this sexual misconduct by any standard? No, I know we're not all experts in this discussion necessarily, but what does your gut tell you? If we can get the microphones moving around. Creating a hostile environment.
I actually think it's a report.
Okay, go ahead.
Because of the fact that she's saying I didn't really want to do anything, but I'm tired of having the deal. So now
Okay.
they're kind of, she's taking it and putting it on the professor, saying, now you deal with it.
Right.
And this is sexual harassment. Whether you want to say that they told them, you know, they did not say, please don't talk to me that way, I don't like it, it's still sexual harassment.
Right. Right, there's something to that, absolutely. Because at this point, we know there's a problem. We know there's a concern. We know this person isn't comfortable in the classroom, seemingly. I mean, maybe we don't know the extent, the duration, the particulars, but we know that we have a student who's uncomfortable. That in itself is obviously going to get our attention. We know that something needs to be done. We just don't necessarily know what the next step is yet based on only that information. We also have this line, I'm not sure what to do. What do we make of that? After she comes right out, she's like, well, I don't know what to do.
That she's asking somebody.
Right. Absolutely, guidance, looking for advice.
I think the line that we used to talk seems, tells me that she's trying to cut him off, and that he is persisting.
Right, so it seems implicit here, like this is something that's gone on for a while. If she's tired of it, probably we do have a line. Go ahead.
How do we actually know that something is happening and she's not just sitting next to a nose picker and she doesn't want to sit next to it?
I'm going to jump on the website and add an additional nose picker protocol. But no, he raised a good point, right? How do we know? That's an excellent point that we need to address, because actually, that comes back to what Tom was saying about the faculty person's position. When you're in a classroom and you're hearing information like this, it would be unreasonable to expect anyone to be an investigator, or to expect anyone to know exactly what's happening, or to expect people to find out more about what's happening. What we do know is that there's a student who is concerned, is upset in some way, and we do have enough cause to at least be suspicious that maybe it is sexual harassment. We don't have a lot of detail, but maybe it is. But at that point, it wouldn't necessarily, wouldn't ever really be the faculty person's responsibility to say, oh, well, this is definitely sexual harassment, let me give you the next steps. Or, no, that's clearly not, I think there might be a nose picker involved in this situation. Because the concern is, if it's a faculty person making that kind of determination, making that judgment call, well, what happens when the faculty person doesn't make the right call and people's complaints get ignored? Things get swept under the rug and people regret saying anything in the first place. So in a case like that, if there's any doubt, if there's some concern, that's why the recommendation at that time is, okay, kick it up to the administration. Tell Christine, tell myself, so that way we can reach out to the student and we can talk a little bit more about what the situation looks like, and more particularly, what they want us to do and what we can do for that person. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying that that's a good point you raise, because the whole point is we don't want to put that burden on the faculty to decide what that is or isn't. But if there's suspicion, okay, let's make sure that student gets heard out, gets the best care they can possibly get, and kick it up to Christine or myself. Does that make sense?
We are not given any cues whatsoever about what gender these people are.
Yep.
Would it matter?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. A girlfriend,
Nope.
you know, if they thought they were talking
Do you mean if it was like actually a platonic situation?
Yeah, this student is actually locker room talk.
Okay. Well, that, I mean, the broad question is, well, does gender, sexuality, orientation, do any of these things matter? And the short answer is no. Everybody would be getting the same treatment, the same equitable process. That's what everybody has the right to expect. But you're right, there's room for miscommunication here. And that's going to be true of every single situation. And that's, again, why it's a great thing that it comes up to the folks who are going to talk directly to the student and sort out in more detail, well, okay, what exactly did happen? What is the nature of the situation? And maybe it turns out to be nothing, in which case nothing more really needs to happen. If it does turn out to be more, well, we can address that on a case-by-case basis, but that's all the stuff that happens in the ether past the initial reporting to the administration process. And that's what, in a lot of ways, protects and makes the job of faculty easier, because if there is a concern that comes forward, onus is not on you to figure out exactly what the nature of it is. That's a discussion that can be had later, discreetly, and with the student having been given a lot of rights and options. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's not up for us to decide.
Right, exactly. And that protects everybody, because the student can't be ignored.
But he brings up a point. Does that mean that we end up reporting locker room talk if it makes a student uncomfortable?
If there's someone uncomfortable, then yeah, that is a concern. That should come forward.
It's not enough for us to stand up and say, knock it off.
Well, this is going to get into a lot of hypotheticals. So we can't get too deep into the weeds on this, but you're right. There are a lot of, this is an enormously gray subject sometimes. It really, really is. And I'm happy to hash out any hypotheticals we possibly want to afterwards, but I will say this really quickly on that point. If it is considered or is possibly sexual misconduct, if there's a doubt in mind, pick it up to the administration and take it from there. Better to err on the side of caution, of course. And if it really ends up not being a violation, or if it turns out that there's not a victim who is interested in pursuing anything further, does not require additional accommodations, doesn't want us to do anything else, and we in good faith can respect all of those wishes, then okay, no harm done. Better to err on the side of caution, because the consequences are limited if it turns out to really be nothing of great concern at all. Does that make sense?
Greg, can I
Please,
say one
go
thing?
ahead.
The idea of kicking it up to the next level. Hello? Yes. Okay, good. Why we're encouraging you to kick it up to the next level is this is so ambiguous, but it may not be ambiguous when it gets to Greg or I.
Very good point.
Because we may have reports that Mackenzie has done this before in other classes. We may have reports that Ash makes these invalid reports every semester. So by setting it up the line, we'll have information that you won't have, and we'll be better able to make a determination. Not every case that you refer to us does the student get disciplined, or we're starting to investigate them, we get better and better at it. So I think if you just refer them to us, we'll have more tools to get to the bottom of whether it is locker room talk or whether there's something serious going on.
That's right, and I really appreciate that distinction. It's important, because so much of why we do what we do is informed by what we can't expect to know. What we can't expect to know as administrators, what we can't expect to know as faculty. But when the information comes up, and if it can be recorded and centralized, we do know if there's a pattern. If this same person has committed the same offense with 3 different people, and those 3 different people reported it to 3 different professors, and that never came out of that classroom, then we have no way of knowing that we do have an ongoing problem, a problem that's likely to persist. But if we do find out as these situations emerge, well, then we have a pattern, then we have a history, we can act on that, and we can make sure that we stop these problems so that it doesn't become a pervasive part of the climate. Something that goes ignored and unobserved. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Great, okay, so having said that, well, okay, at this point in the conversation, we are admittedly in kind of an ambiguous place, and that's okay. It really should be, because that's generally what we deal with. But based on what we've said so far, what do we think the professor should say to Ash? Anybody want to volunteer? The script?
Excuse me, but
Yes.
given what you have said thus far, and earlier, I think the professor should say, well, you need to come with me.
Okay.
And go to a counselor or go to Christine's office. I mean, I don't think there's a choice at this point for anybody who has heard what you have told us to do at this point.
Did you want to add to that?
Yes. That's absolutely the right
That's absolutely what we're trying to tell people to do. However, we don't want to take away from human communication. We want you to be there, we want you to listen, we want you to talk to them like they're people. We don't want you to just say, all right, stop, hold the phone, we're going down the hallway. Like, we want there to be a little bit of a relationship there. So don't feel like you have to just automatically be like, stop talking, we're leaving. But you can say, you know, I understand what you're saying, I feel like there might be more to this. Unfortunately, everything you tell me can't be confidential, but you have so many opportunities that are. Let me show you what those are. Let me take you there. Let me go with you and bring you to them. And that's definitely going to help them be more comfortable with what's going to happen next, too.
How do you avoid the special relationship?
I'm a little concerned with that, given what I've heard and how I've interpreted it. If you continue a dialogue at that point without informing the student that this has to go to another place, you're building a relationship with the student around this particular issue. And therefore, in effect, on its face, you are violating the very rules that we have just heard that we will do. So I'm not saying, you know, like coldly stand up and drag whoever it is out of the office. And you can be professional about that, but there's absolutely no way at that point I'm establishing a relationship over this issue.
And I see what you mean by that, but I would say expression aside, there's on a basic level not anything too different between what Jessica has said and what you said. And why I say that is in both cases what we're doing is acknowledging, even thanking the person for coming forward and indicating, look, this conversation as such really shouldn't continue. I can help you get resources. And basically just being there for the student to address their needs in any other way that you would as a faculty person. Now that's not saying that you should ask more questions. It's not saying you should investigate or try to dig deeper into the situation yourself. That's not saying that you should give that person your cell phone number to call you if they're feeling upset or anything like that. It's just saying, however we personally feel comfortable expressing it, we do have to say, this isn't a confidential conversation. I can connect you with confidential resources. And what would you like me to do for you now? That can happen, that can be said in many, many different ways in varying degrees of detail, but the fundamental is the same. You're not asking that conversation to continue beyond what is already appropriate, but you are doing the responsible, the ethical, and the basically human thing of making sure that they do get offered resources.
Well, then I need some clarity. If I'm going to ask this person what they would like me to do now, what are my choices as a faculty person? I have none. My choice is to take the student to an administrator. So if the student says, I would really like you to just hear me out, or I would really just like you to tell me how to solve the problem, which in 9 times out of 10 the faculty is really rather astute at doing, but I get this. I don't want to ask that question. I don't want to open that door under the circumstances as presented this morning.
Christine, do you want to say something?
I was going to say that your options are offering them support. When you ask them what they want, I don't want to talk to anybody else. This is it. I don't want to go any further. And you can give them materials, phone numbers to follow up with on their own. They may not want to go any further, but you are going to report it to us so we can go further. So you don't have to develop that relationship. We'll develop the relationship once you give us the information. Does that help?
Sure, thank you.
Yes. This is a good segue. Stage structure. Well, I think at this time, just in the interest of getting to the point that we want to make, let's go back to our scene, because I want to demonstrate what could be a very reasonable response to this situation as it's emerged so far. Because what we definitely have all concluded is that we have reason enough to be suspicious that some kind of sexual misconduct may have occurred. And so what we might be able to say in response to that at this time, even if the student's exact wishes and the exact nature of the situation is ambiguous, this is what could be said in response to that.
Okay, that turned into making comments about how hot I look. And I really don't...
Ash, I'm really sorry I have to interrupt you, and thank you for coming forward and talking to me. But it sounds like you're going to tell me something involving sexual harassment. And please know that I want to help. But if you were to continue this conversation, you need to know that the college takes situations like this very seriously, and I'm required to share what you tell me with the Title IX director or the coordinator of the Dean of Students. They'll want to discuss your rights and options with you, and they will do their best to protect you. But they may need to investigate further or even contact law enforcement if there's a safety concern. If you would like to speak to somebody confidential, that's your right, and I can help you access 24/7 counseling services. We are partners with these agencies and we trust them. And I do want to help, so what would you like me to do?
Well, that sounds good, thank you. Yeah, this has been going on for so long, and I just feel so uncomfortable, and I really want the college to do something about Mackenzie.
Okay, so if you would like, I can bring you to the Dean of Students right now, or the Title IX coordinator, and so you can talk about options as to what the college can do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate that. So in that situation, what we've done is we've just expressed to the students support, gratitude for coming forward, some warmth, some humanity, while also being able to indicate that there are limitations for what faculty can do in these situations, but there's a lot of help available, that there are options. As a faculty person, the extent to which you need to engage those options are just make sure you hand over the information. We have informational brochures available on this table that are for students that explain in a reasonable amount of detail what they would need to know if they come forward, if they decide that they would like to engage the college, and also if they'd like to engage the community resources. They have the option of engaging confidential community counseling through Safe Futures or the Sexual Assault Crisis Center. They have the option of coming to the college for either discipline or just for accommodations to make sure that they feel more safe and comfortable on campus. But the obligation of the faculty is to make sure that the administration knows, to make sure the student understands basically what will happen next, and to provide them with some information to act on. Now, at this time, just so that we can make sure that we're moving along, I think what we would like to do now is move on to our next scenario, which should also help to further clarify some of these points that are raised. And so with that, I'd like to turn things over to Tom Clark, who's going to be bringing us along to what was originally considered Scenario 3. We're going to be jumping ahead to Scenario 3. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Hey folks, our stellar crew is going to act out. I think you have Scenario 3 on your table. So if we could have your attention, please. Sorry, I can't repeat it. Okay, if we could have your attention, please. This is Scenario 3, Pat and Chris, I believe. Please meet Pat and Chris.
Professor, can I talk about something? Yeah, of course, yes. What's going on? Well, Chris just stopped me in the hall, and he asked me to tell you he's going home because he doesn't feel well. He probably doesn't want me to say this, but I think what's really happening is that Chris is feeling uncomfortable with someone that makes him feel really uncomfortable here, and he's too embarrassed to tell anyone about it. So he really trusts you. Can you talk to you? Can you do something, but not let him know that I said anything? I won't joke right now, but that's the end of our scene, by the way. So, good discussion.
Okay, thank you. A hand for Pat and Chris, please. As you discuss on your table amongst yourselves, if you could have not heard he and heard Pat and Chris as Pat and Chris, so we can keep the gender neutrality going. The purpose of this, I think, is oftentimes, had conversations with folks, when you take the gender out of something, it changes oftentimes the view and the judgment that's made. The locker room conversation, if you would. When is it unwelcome? When, guys are talking like guys talk, or as my daughter talked while watching, what was that show on with the women in New York? Sex and the City? I don't know how that conversation goes, but so when is it unwelcome? When it's the presumption because it's perhaps same gender as opposed to different genders? Do we have different perceptions of what may be taking place because we have an inherent gender bias? So in this conversation, if you could treat Pat and Chris as a gender-neutral type names, maybe that'll make our conversation more interesting. It's about 5-10 minutes amongst yourselves, please. Let's move forward. I was also directed by the nurses that it's unhealthy to go too long without proper nourishment. So let me ask you, folks, please, kind of the courtesy of your attention. Please. Thank you. What's different about this one than the other scenario, if anything?
It's very vague.
It's very
Vague.
Thank you. What would you like to know to be less vague?
Well, it doesn't say she doesn't give you any information except that this person feels uncomfortable. You don't know what's causing him to feel uncomfortable.
Or her, yes.
Okay, or her.
Okay.
So you can't really give any information.
Well, how do you solve that problem?
I would tell Pat that he needs to talk to the dean of students and give them the information, because they may have other information that somebody else may have come and talk
Okay.
about, and they may know what the problem is.
Okay, so the suggestion is it's vague, and asking Pat to have Chris talk to the dean.
No, Pat can go to the dean.
Have Pat to go to the dean, I'm sorry.
Because they don't want, Pat doesn't want Chris to know that he said anything.
Okay,
So Pat should go to the dean
okay.
and explain the situation, and then the dean should decide what the next step is going to be.
The advantage with that approach is it follows one of the adages I gave you, right? Is to do as little as possible, right? And let's move it on along. What do you think of that response?
Good.
How is the student, Pat, likely to feel? Or potentially could feel? I hear it blown off. That the college doesn't take, or this faculty member at least doesn't take it seriously?
No, we are, because we're doing something. We're
We'll take it to the
telling
dean.
him that this is the step you need to take
Okay.
to get
Okay,
Pat, to get Chris, if he needs help.
okay.
That's the dean's job to find out what's going on, but Chris may not want to, if Pat doesn't want Chris to know that he or she's talking, Chris may not want to talk to anybody.
Does, I hate to go in this direction, because I think the last time it happened, there was something about an unsanitary habit. But at the risk of another unsanitary habit being mentioned, go right ahead.
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily appropriate to send it to the dean, because Chris could be uncomfortable because Chris has this allergy that makes him turn bright purple based on the perfume of the person sitting next to him.
Thank you very much.
And he's very uncomfortable.
Thanks for
So,
cleaning it up.
I don't know what uncomfortable is. So I would like to talk to Chris, and since Chris trusts and respects me, I think I should ask Pat to send Chris my way.
Before you do that, is there a more direct way to get the information you're seeking?
Call Chris, email Chris.
Even more direct. Ask Pat.
I don't want to ask Pat.
Why?
Because I do not want to violate any confidentialities that Pat and Chris may have.
Ah, is there a confidentiality between Pat and Chris that you must respect?
Absolutely.
And where does that come from? Because I think, if I remember right, Pat said, Chris doesn't know I'm talking to you, wouldn't want me to say this. So hasn't Pat already violated whatever confidentiality may have existed?
That's true.
Probably.
And in my world, when you waive the privilege, it's waived, you know?
Yeah, but I'm gonna try to preserve Chris's friendship and not push further.
Okay. You bring up an interesting point in terms of preserving the friendship. Because if Chris, or anyone, is the victim of any one of these horrendous things, have they not lost a significant element of control over their lives? And we do not wish to re-victimize them in what we do, trying to be helpful, do we? So doing something that causes Chris to realize that that sense of confidentiality at best has been breached, wouldn't that cause the harm that the first thing you do is cause none of? So don't we have to be delicate in how we handle this? As we do with everything we do. So how can we do that? So if you ask Chris, right, at the risk of breaching whatever that confidentiality used to be because it's now been broken, right, might you get the answer that you're seeking? Because you have an obligation to do some things, do you not? Potentially. Are you at that point where you have to do something? Do you know if you're at that point where you have to do something? Which I guess is a different question.
At that point, you really are invested in those particular individuals. And your job and your purpose is to keep confidentiality, is to find out through dialogue and through a connection with the student what exactly is going on. And from that point, it goes to the next team member.
Antoinette, you bring up a great point. What confidentiality is there between the faculty member and the student? We talked about FERPA. Is that conversation FERPA protected? No, right? Because it's not in a record yet, right? Because I mentioned and made a distinction, didn't do it when we were talking before, but FERPA covers personally identifiable student information maintained in college records. It doesn't cover what you see of a student or what you hear a student say, unless those observations are reduced to writing. Then both are FERPA protected, because the U.S. Department of Education said recently, it's too hard and not necessarily credible to say whether I'm disclosing information from my memory that I saw or heard, or from the document I read. In the old days, I used to advise people who had records and saw a student do some things. Well, if you're remembering it, it's not FERPA protected. If you're reading it or recalling it from a record, it is FERPA protected, right? But you could read the document to refresh your recollection, and then it's not FERPA, and it's like, nah, too many hairs to split. And of course, you see what happens, right? So there's a question of whether there is any confidentiality, and I would assert none between the faculty member and the student. Although at some point, it's likely, potentially likely at least, that that conversation may be reduced to writing when something is communicated to Christine or Greg, in which case that conversation may very well have been bootstrapped and now covered by FERPA. I know, complicated.
I'm partly because I'm a sociologist, but I want to point out, you keep talking about confidentiality and obligations in terms of FERPA and what's sort of legally required or not required. But there is some sort of social sense of norms and expectations of privacy and how you relate. And as instructors, I mean, we have to consider those too. So it's not just a matter of what we're bound to or not bound to by FERPA. We're also expected to treat our students respectfully, and so partly we have to think of issues about how we interact with them in terms of just social norms and things like that. So it's not just. I think we're maybe just focusing too much on what FERPA says we can or can't do, and there's broader issues about how.
You bring up great points about the norms. You're talking to a lawyer here, so Article 6 of the Constitution talks about supremacy of things. The international treaties are supreme over the Constitution, over federal acts, over federal regs, over state acts, over state regs. Ultimately, board policy kind of falls at the bottom. I'd say we try to balance all of those, including the norms, but where we can't, legal requirements supersede the norms. So it's a balancing act to the extent we can do that, and we're talking about how we can do that, and I think there's a way. But ultimately, with all due respect to the norms, the legal requirements prevail. In other words, it's not a defense to a lawsuit or a claim that we had following certain norms. Jen?
Hi, I just want to add to kind of along the same line as what Steve was saying, and we had talked about this as we were going over everything. If a student came to me and said this, I would want to find out why the student was feeling uncomfortable, because it could be, like you were saying, about bodily issues, or it could be, and I also think that our responsibility as educators is to create a safe learning environment. So I would want to know overall what's going on in the classroom, and then if the student started to say something that had to do, again, with sexual misconduct, and then I would stop and say, listen, this is, kind of go into that.
I think you bring up a great point, because in large part, I think we're talking about whether the threshold has been crossed to give what I unfortunately refer to as the Miranda warning. Are we talking about something that puts me in the role of a mandated reporter, or are we talking about, I'm in a different position where I don't have to report them? And I think, because that's the focus of our conversation here today, we need some additional information. Can I get the gentleman in the back and then I'll come? Yes, sir.
This whole conversation is somewhat problematic because we've
Thank you.
privileged Chris as if what he's saying is accurate. We've got no proof of this. We don't know if Chris is sitting on the other side of the room and wants to get back at Pat or wants to do something. We have no idea what's going on. This is so vague and immaterial. It's really a hazard to step into.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So the question is, how can we do this professionally, compassionately, and supportively to determine what is going on that we should be addressing, or what's something that we shouldn't be addressing at all because of norms and respect and private lives and those kinds of things? Yes.
Terry, you took my words from me, but definitely it's all about perception, and we don't know if the perception is accurate. So I think that's putting it aside. We do know that Chris is missing class and he was sick for whatever reason he was sick. So I think when he comes back, just simply saying, hey Chris, missed you in class the other day, how are you doing? Is everything okay? Very simply, because it gives him the opportunity to share information or choose not to. His choice.
So when Chris comes back, have a conversation. What if Chris doesn't come back for a while? Right. Yes. And then we
don't know whether this is accurate or not. It's perception of somebody, and we've never, I think,
Okay.
something that doesn't help
Okay.
them.
Okay. I think I saw a hand over here to sort of be inclusive, if I could.
Is there a mandate for us to determine whether we're a mandated reporter?
Yes.
What if Chris is a bigot, just doesn't like sitting next to a certain person in class?
Absolutely, that's a possibility. It could be the person next to him doesn't bathe very often. It could be other unsanitary habits. It could be...
And isn't it incumbent on Chris to deal with certain uncomfortable things in life?
Yes. And so how do we enable Chris to do that if there's something going on that needs to be addressed? And how can we
I think
discharge...
at certain points you have to let Chris work through his uncomfortableness.
Okay, and how can we, because we're all educators, we're all here walking hand in hand with students to help get them to a different place when they graduate than when they started. How can we do that?
Well, I think, I wasn't sure who made that comment, but if you open the door to Chris, I noticed your absence, is there anything wrong? Can I do anything to help?
Yep.
Do you think this will happen again? If they don't walk through that door, I'm not sure my role should be to do anything further.
Well, if you start talking to Chris that way, if I heard you right, Chris doesn't know that Pat's talking to you, and you're coming out of the blue. And if something happened that they've been victimized, are you potentially re-victimizing the individual by confronting them in that fashion? However gentle and diplomatic.
Well, if they're not in my class, then I have a concern as to whether or not this is going to occur again. Is there some accommodation that needs to be made? I'm coming at it from the context of the class administrator.
Right.
I noticed your absence.
Right.
Was there a reason? Can I help? Do I need to make accommodations with you? But if they don't walk through that door, I'm not sure that our role should go to further. Because it could be something completely not to do with what we're doing here, and it may be an uncomfortableness that Chris needs to work through himself, if in fact there is an uncomfortableness.
How can we get Chris closer to the door? Oh, yes.
I'd just like to suggest that we could head off some of this. For example, any students before they enroll in classes have to complete a half hour. This is acceptable behavior, so you don't tell homophobic jokes, you don't tell jokes about sex, you don't do this, you don't do that. If you do, then these are the steps that the college is legally required to take. And you can't even register for classes until you've done that.
Great suggestion, and I think a lot of places are doing stuff like Haven, for instance, which isn't necessarily what you're addressing, but prior to registration. But if the information that I have is accurate, and you guys are closer to the ground than I am, a large percentage of your students may register in the 2 or 3 weeks right around the beginning of the semester. So time to do all of that is rather short unless you want to cut enrollments, and I think that's not the time to do that.
They could sit through a half-hour training and sign off that they understand their responsibilities
Sure.
as a member of this academic community
Sure.
to act according to certain socially prescribed norms.
Absolutely a possibility. But that doesn't address Chris's immediate need.
As individuals that we are mandated to report.
Right.
They need to know that before they can start speaking.
Correct, and that's part of the reason for the Miranda warning and perhaps the syllabus statement. But would you make good points?
Scenario happens, so that Pat or whoever it is would know, right, by reporting to me that a student left because they're uncomfortable, that now we're in this rather gray area of FERPA and mandated reporting.
Well, if you remember earlier this morning, we talked about there are some affirmative obligations that we are required to do when a situation like this happens. And we can't defer that to the beginning of the semester, a half-hour session, and a sign-off. We have a duty to act besides reporting when a situation, perhaps something like this, occurs. Yes.
Based on the ambiguity of this situation, this third party is saying, someone's making Chris feel uncomfortable. We are assuming it's a student. What if it's me? I make Chris uncomfortable.
You are? Ah. And let me broaden it a little bit. We've been sort of talking about student-on-student type issues. Does any of what we're required to do change if we're talking about employee upon employee, or employee with students, or students with employees? No, no. The law is clear that we have to extend all of these obligations, these options, these services to employees and students alike. It gets a little more difficult in the sense that with employees, there's a constitutional and statutory right to employment, there's collective bargaining agreements. Students don't quite have those same protections.
But what is Chris going to do? Because Chris cannot come to me and tell me he feels uncomfortable.
Okay, let's talk about how we can get Chris to the door, how we can discharge our responsibilities. And by way of quick review, what are our responsibilities to do? Generally a safe learning environment, but what specific steps are we required to do? We've got a mandating reporting responsibility, but with respect to student employees, we're required to provide them with support, notice of support services, right? That concise 8-page notification of Antoinette and Jessica, police, others that are available, that they can go for confidential places where they can talk it through, get services at no cost, legal help, all those kinds of things, right? And or if there is a request for academic adjustments, change my academic setting, their student work, their working setting, or an employee, their working, we have to engage those. So we have a duty to engage the person who seems to be a victim of these things, if that's it, and I'm not sure we're there yet, we have to do that. And of course, give them the warning that they're a mandated reporter. Sir?
Yes, some discussions we're having at our table brought to mind a personal anecdote. Several years ago, my wife was taking a course, and she was sitting near a student, and it was an unfortunate genetic collision. The student had the gene that would make garlic appear on their skin, the smell appear on their skin, and my wife had the gene that would really be sensitive to that. It would practically turn her stomach, and she was uncomfortable. She just changed her seed. I mean, it could be anything. We had several other scenarios like that at this table. That is way too vague. Why is the student uncomfortable?
All right, let's narrow it down, because lunch is about to be served. What if you talk to Chris, all right? Well, first of all, does it make any difference that as to what you're required to do, because Chris is not the apparent victim? And by that I say apparent, because how many times have we heard the old line, I got a friend, kind of thing. So, might Pat be talking about him or herself in the guise of Chris? And again, I emphasize the word might. Or might there be an issue with Chris? But in any event, the first step is Pat that you're talking to. And Pat, is Pat possibly reporting sexual misconduct to you? You don't know. Is it possible?
Sure.
Okay. So how do you cross the line with Pat if you can? You ask, is there sexual assault, sexual harassment? What are you telling me? Can you tell me anything more? Do you know what it is that's causing the discomfort? And if Pat is able to say, there's a boyfriend issue, there's a spouse issue, there's, that the person with which they're uncomfortable has said or done something that would fall in those apparent categories without you having made a determination about it, then you're closer to that line where you have to say, okay, we seem to be talking about something now that I should really talk to you, I should mention before we go on any further. I'm a mandated reporter. The college and I care deeply about these issues and want to get you the help and the assistance that you and or Chris may need, right? Here is the college's concise, brief notification. These are all the agencies and people on campus that you can talk to. Some off campus are confidential, right? Many of them, all of them are free, right? And I think the most important thing you have to ask, and I remember this as probably the most important thing I learned in law school. I was doing a legal clinic. I can remember our clinical instructor saying, when you interview your client, they're going to tell you the facts. And your mind is going to race in terms of the huge constitutional issues that you see yourself arguing before those 9-robed justices of the Supreme Court. But before you go too far down that road, don't forget to ask the client, what are you asking of me? Because it may be something entirely different than what you're thinking about, and you would not have served your client's interest by not asking the simple question, what can I do for you? Or what are you asking of me? Right? You got to ask that question because that's going to determine in large part where you're going to go. Right? Then, if you get to the point where you have to provide the announcement, the warning, whatever, how about giving, because I don't think your obligations change, you give Pat the information that you're required to give. The college's notification of the resources that are available. Maybe 2 copies. Pat, here's one for you, because you may need some of these, perhaps. If not, you don't have to use them. Would you feel comfortable giving these to Chris? Right? Then Chris has access to them, right? If Pat delivers them. But you've taken a step to get them to Chris in a non-threatening, non-re-victimizing sort of way, right? Yes, ma'am.
With regards to the affirmative obligations that we do have
Yes.
as mandatory reporting, my understanding is that we have the mandatory reporting affirmative obligation, we have to give them the notice of support,
Yes.
and we have to do, what's the third thing?
Academic adjustments if they're requested.
Necessary. Okay, so if we give them the sheet of paper at the beginning of the semester with our syllabus, if we tell them we are mandatory reporters, and if we say academic adjustment can be made at the first day of the class, do we need to engage in any of this conversation individually? Is that an affirmative obligation, since we've already met our affirmative obligation in the classroom on the first day?
No shortcuts to this. No. We have to do this on the spot. There's no short, that doesn't work. You have to engage the student. I think Jessica talked about not replacing the human conversation. That connection, that moment is critical. But let me finish if I could.
Just like the police have when they issued, I want a card so that I don't misstate my legal obligation.
I think there you have the brochure that has a sample warning on it that you could, if you want to pull it out and read it to the student. I'm not sure that's the most effective way to do it because there is no, unlike Miranda, there is no legislated language that you have to do. You basically have to communicate that you care, that the college takes this seriously, that you're a mandated reporter, and how can I help you? We'll do academic adjustment support services. You communicate that in your words, but what's critically important in my world is that you do that as empathetically as possible and then you document it appropriately. Because as you may know, what happens then is either going to create a bond or create a litigant. Right? And we want to do all that we can to serve our students, not to cause them to file some kind of a claim. And of course, they may need time to process all of this, so we want to make sure that they know that we have some services or those that we partner with that can help them work through what they may be going through. But let me go back a bit, because again, lunch is getting cold, and I'll get your questions. What if you offered to Pat, right? Would you want me to meet with you and Chris about this? would you want to broach this, what I'm trying to say, with Chris? And would the two of you like to come in and meet with me? And so the two of us can talk. So Chris has a companion, that confidentiality between friends can be maintained, right? And we can deliver those kinds of services, right? Would that be a second way that potentially it could go?
So my feeling is, Pat should really not be, in my opinion, part of the conversation that you have with Chris. Because ethically, anything that Chris wants to say or not say is up to Chris.
So what I hear you saying is,
What
Pat
I'm
should
saying is,
Pat should not be
now
part of
out
that
the-
conversation unless Chris wants him or her there.
Yes,
Okay,
and so
I
we
believe
should
that.
be asking Pat, do you know if it's this, do you know if it's that? We should not be engaging in any of that with Pat. If we feel like there's a concern, we should be asking Chris, you know, somebody approached me that they're concerned about you, they thought you might be uncomfortable, is there anything you want to talk to me about? And direct, I would not direct any conversation at all to Pat.
I stand here not with the answer, but offering you approaches. If that's the approach that you think is responsible, professional, supportive, and will not re-victimize Chris, God bless you.
Well, if he wants to bring her in, I'm all for it, or she, he, she, whatever. But it just seems like this Pat person could be inserting herself into something
Clearly, he or she is. And so
that might not, he, she, whatever, ambiguous or not, it just seems to me that it's unethical to engage this third person in conversation about it at all.
In my
Except to
world,
acknowledge that you're coming to me with a concern and I will address it.
pardon me, I used to stand in front of classrooms because I get to be a professor on occasion. When you say unethical, in my world, that's an association's code of conduct. Believe it or not, we lawyers have a code of conduct. Nurses have a code of conduct. When you say it's unethical, I hear you're breaching your nurse's code of conduct. Unless you think it's immoral, which in my world is your personal code of conduct, and that personal code governs how you behave, but not the rest of us, right? So I'm not sure how you measure right and wrong with that, except we're all adult professionals who I hope have the best interests of both the students and the college to which we owe duties of loyalty to, because they're our employers, and that we can discharge them as consistently and appropriately as possible. It's a difficult balancing act in this area, and nobody's suggesting anything different. Sir, you've had your hand up for a while, and I apologize for not responding.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I feel like we're just skirting around what really is being told to us, and I'm going to go back to what Trish was saying and to what Steve was saying. You're trying to ask us to balance between what we're supposed to do legally and what we're supposed to do by social norms. And you're cutting definitions between what's ethics, what's morality, what's norms. And what I really hear, the message that's coming to me is, if I don't do it right, if it becomes a litigation, I'm in trouble as a professor. No matter what my norms are, no matter what my morality is, no matter what I think my ethical concerns are, if I don't do it right, the state's not going to cover my backside. So I want the Miranda card that Trish was just talking about. Because if you tell me that by reading that I'm not creating a bond with a student, I'm hearing don't create the bond because that might lead to litigation and that might get us into trouble. So I want to hear clearly what you want us to do in these situations that avoids litigation. No talk about bonds, norms, moralities, or anything else, because that's what all of us are coming from, because that's why we're teachers.
Thank you. Let me be as clear as possible, and it's probably repetitive, and I apologize for that. One, there is no Miranda card that you're going to get. Two, the law trumps the norms that you're talking about. You have a duty as a mandated reporter when you're faced with a situation where a student has approached you and communicated to you, whether for themselves or somebody else, that they or somebody else that they're talking about has been the victim of sexual misconduct, intimate partner violence, stalking, that you have a duty to engage that student, first reasonably, properly, to inform them that the conversation cannot be confidential, so they then have the choice to decide whether to have the conversation with you or not. It's their choice. Puts them on notice. Secondly, depending on what they tell you, disclosure or a report is going to make a huge difference, but in any event, you're going to communicate that to Greg Souza immediately. Who the student was, what they said to you, date, place, and time. Email is the best way of doing it. For a protected record, be careful what you say. Right? You're going to offer the student the concise notification of support services. You're going to include that you did that in the email. At that point, you're going to be as compassionate, supportive, as professional as possible, but you want to get that student, let's presume it's a reporting victim, to the support services and not engage them in depth beyond that. Because I'm presuming, and I mean this with no disrespect, sir, you don't know what you're doing. There are people better skilled at it that need to get involved.
Absolutely.
Have I been clear?
Yes.
Crystal?
Yes.
Thank you.
Is there a legal requirement, because in any classroom, right here.
I'm sorry.
Looking at the statistics that you put up at the beginning of your presentation, in any classroom, there are a handful of students that have had issues, either at the college or beyond, and we are mandated to report those. Am I legally required to investigate all 20 of those students to find out if any of that has occurred and therefore kick into my mandated reporter role?
You said two things, and I'll agree with you. You have no duty to investigate. You just have to know whether you're talking about a sexual violence matter. Because if you're talking about a bullying matter, or you're talking about, some other issue, and the experts here can tell you better, but one of the issues that I think you folks have dealing with first and second year college students, presuming that's who you're dealing with, is, in the K-12 environment, there's a lot of behavior that was age-specific at the time that becomes stalking in post-secondary environment. And there's no real smooth transition for them to do that. So they may be engaging in stuff they did last year at high school that was, sort of okay, and is now, holy cow, I can get expelled from this place, right? You have no duty to report anything except when a student comes to you and shares information with you. In other words, I heard you say that you may have 5, 6, 7 students in class who have been a victim of something.
Statistically, that's what you said.
Correct. But who do you report? You don't report any of that until somebody comes to you and engages you in a conversation. Then you have a duty to refer that person to appropriate sources, tell them that you have to report this to Greg, see if they need any academic adjustments. You have no duty to investigate, and you should not investigate the matter at all. That's not your role. You're to teach the class.
How does that seems to be in conflict with what you've said in this Pat and Chris scenario.
No, because Greg's going to do the investigation, right? What we're talking with Pat and Chris is how to get the apparent victim the support services that they need, because you now, on behalf of the college, are aware of it, without re-victimizing Chris. So either engage through Pat, or the general way of approaching Chris has been mentioned a couple times, when he or she comes back to class, if that happens, or inviting a three-party conversation, or some other way that's out there that's compassionate, supportive, and professional. I see no other hands. I have no idea what time it is, but let's call it lunchtime, right? Thank you all for your participation.
So, if I could just sum up a little bit. First off, thank you so much. I appreciate the debate. I really appreciate the conversation, because it would be impossible for us to all leave this room feeling like we had 100% a handle on this, because we should. That's unrealistic. But what's important is that we are increasingly aware and just conscientious, because this is what's going to make the difference between a student getting the help he or she needs and not. So if I can just wrap up. We have resources available to us for this conversation to continue, and sorry, I just do that sometimes. But just want to sum up, we have some resources available for you to continue learning and to continue this conversation. On this table right here is something far less appealing than sandwiches, but far more important. Nothing's more important than sandwiches, I don't know why I said that. But over there, in that table, we have our brochures of two kinds. One is to hand out to students. That is our Sexual Misconduct Resources and Education brochure, which has a lot of very important information in accessible language for students. I would recommend you all just have a few, so that you just have them on hand for students should they need them. And at your tables, what you have are the brochures designed specifically for faculty and staff. And on the inside flap, you'll see, in summary, 3 steps of what you need to do. As long as you hit those 3 bullet points, most likely everything's going to be just fine. Joe, did you want to add something?
Greg, will you mention FYE?
Yes, and I think that was Susan's point, and what we can do to try to curb some of this at the outset. Fortunately, we have started to make some effort in that direction. Partnering with Jody has been absolutely fantastic and has been a great help in all of this. What we've begun to do is incorporate sexual misconduct education into our first year experience courses. So that way students will have a foundation in this subject, they'll have a way to talk about this, the conversation can be broached, and that is integrated with our Haven training module. So they'll get a good overview in topics like what these things are conceptually, and also what they can do about it. It includes our own policy information, so we can now feel better that a lot of our students, certainly not all, but many of our students are going to have this exposure to this information early on in their academic career, particularly because as they transfer into the 4-year institutions, they'll have missed a lot of that education they would have otherwise had. So to sum up, this is a difficult conversation, and I thank you for having it. And as long as we are doing our best to be professional and compassionate and presenting the information to students as they need it, we're going to be okay, because it allows our students to have the choice, have the ability to respond in the ways they need to. So, that said, thank you all very, very much. Enjoy your lunch.
Just 1 minute, I want to also thank you for the great discussion, for participating. I'm so glad it worked out that way. There'll be a survey on your tables for this portion of the program, so please fill them out so we know how to do it better. Thank you.